Good afternoon, everyone. Wow, this mic is working today. Good afternoon and welcome Appropriation Committee. I'm Chairman Michael Cole. Excited to welcome everybody. Glad everybody made it safely. Let's go ahead and take roll call if we can, Mr. Treasurer.
Board Member Brown. Chair Cole.
Present.
Mr. Green. Ms. Johnson.
Here.
Mr. Jordan.
Here.
Mr. Miller. Board Member Ragland.
Here.
You have a quorum, Chair Cole.
Thank you, Mr. Treasurer. Okay, so today is a fairly robust agenda we have before us. We're going to start off, of course, with approval of the minutes, go into budget requests for 2022 school fiscal year, and go into an ESSER update and our monthly finance report, and then our FAC agenda schedule, which should be just, I don't think that'll be a long discussion, but I think it's just something that helps wet our beak, so to speak, to what we're looking at in the coming year, and then close for adjournment. So with that, is there a motion to approve the minutes?
So move.
Is it moved and seconded? All in favor?
Aye.
All right. Now moving forward to our fiscal year 2022 budget requests. Mr. Gooding.
All right, thank you, Chair Cole. Looking at the screen for Dr. Klein to present her two requests.
She is not on the list of active participants in Zoom that I see.
Okay, I will pinch hit for her, if that's all right, and
Okay.
try to do justice to this one. The first one, 3.01, is a transfer from one operating unit to another, because the board approves the general fund by operating units for the departments, is part of the superintendent's reorganization plan. This is the first, and there may be more of these that come to us as we get into the details of who's managing what budgets and where all the pieces are and they shake out. This one was an $8,080 budget that was part of the Department of Engagement. Felicia Lyons was heading that up. It was part of that work. The Office of Engagement, some of the work stayed with communications, some went to what was accountability, and accountability is now strategic performance and student services. So what we're doing is moving this $8,080 from OPU 937, which was engagement, to OPU 973, which is student services. So we're just getting that aligned to the appropriate chief. So that's the first one.
And Scott, and the reason why it's here is because of the dollar amount and percentage per board policy.
Right. So what we'll
It might seem like a small dollar amount, but we have dollar amount and percentage requirements in policy that we can't do on our own. We have to come and seek an appropriation resolution amendment.
Correct, because that'll show up next week at the board meeting as part of the amended appropriation. You'll see a minus from OPU 937 and a plus to OPU 973, and that'll net out to zero.
Okay.
Item 3.02, this is an increase, again, a part of that transition and that the splitting of the accountability office. This is an increase request of $164,451 as we were working through that. This is part of operating unit 946, which was the accountability office. The majority of that budget is staying there. Actually, all of that is staying with Dr. Russell Brown and the strategic performance piece. Some of the items that were in there were part of both of their operations. So what we want to do is allow him flexibility to keep those dollars there for new things and new initiatives that he may come up with throughout the year, because he wasn't part of that budget process when this was put together. So we want to give him that flexibility, and we're taking a portion of that and moving that over from OPU 946 into 973, which were items that were budgeted originally by Dr. Klein, when at that time she was over the entire Office of Accountability. So we're leaving it where it is, but taking that amount and giving it Dr. Klein so that she can fund those initiatives that she had for, so I'm looking at this, student success cards, she's texting me now, digitization and running the student services that were in there. So we're just leaving it with Dr. Brown to give him flexibility as the new administrator over strategic performance, and giving Dr. Klein and the student services piece the money that she had originally budgeted in 946. So that's now going over to we're adding it to 973.
Okay. Thank you. Are there any questions about this budget appropriation update? All right. Thank you so much, Mr. Gooding and staff, for putting this together. In addition to that, we'll move on to our ESSER update. Good afternoon. I'm totally comfortable with it.
Good afternoon. This is a quarterly update for FAC on our ESSER work. As a reminder, in order to respond to the unique needs that were created as a result of the pandemic, Congress approved a number of new grants to support needs in schools. Over the next few minutes, I'm going to provide the quarterly update about our work to date. Our Columbus City schools have certainly benefited from these funds, but we continue to have a number of needs. I'm going to try to control my own slide. Oh, good, it worked. So as I said last time, I apologize in advance, lots of acronyms in the next couple of slides, but these are the most important ones. When we talk about CARES, CRF, and then we actually have 3 different ESSER funds that we are working with at this time. In your executive summary, you have some more detail about those. Okay. This slide shows the timeline of each of the funds. You can see that they were received in the district and expire at different times. We are certainly in the midst of ESSER 1, which ends in September of 22. We have ESSER 2 funds that will take us through September of 2023, and then we have just begun to work with our ARP, or ESSER 3, and that one ends in September of 2024. All told, we are working with about $450 million over the next 3.5 years. The ARP ESSER does have one additional stipulation, and that is that the district must spend at least 20% for learning recovery activities. You will see as I go through the next couple of slides, we will be well above that 20% threshold. But because there were some new allowable areas that are not typical of federal grant funds, I think the stipulation there was to ensure that districts address academic needs in not just maybe those that had to do with facility management or something like that. So as you can see on this slide, we have a number of allowable areas where we're able to spend those funds. And I would say that at this point, we are on track. We have some strategies within each of the allowable areas. This chart is small. I apologize for that. Again, you do have a hard copy of this one in front of you. But this chart provides a list of all of our funding, again, with the various deadlines to use the dollars. The majority of these funds are geared towards K through 12 schools, although, as you will see, there is a higher education, there were some additional funds allowed for higher education as well. And in our case, we use those in our adult education programs.
Just a quick question.
Yes.
And thank you so much so far for this presentation. As you go through, feel free to highlight some of those areas that we know we're going to really make impact on student achievement, if you will.
Absolutely. Thank you.
I feel AJ Crable in the room. I just
Absolutely. And thank you. Please feel free to stop me at any time. Just a reminder, I know we spoke about this last quarter, but I think that we mentioned, we should mention again that our partners at Columbus, City of Columbus, actually transferred funds that they had received under these same pandemic funds for the use of our students. And you will recall that we bought Chromebooks, provided hotspots for students when we first went into remote learning. So just to call out again for that great partnership. The sources listed in the first 6 boxes have been received. So the CARES, CRF, and broadband, as you will see, we have actually spent all of those allocated funds. They came in quite early in the pandemic. Our ESSER 1 and $2 have been allocated, and we're in the process of using those funds now according to our plan. The ESSER 3 and FEMA sources are pending. We know what the dollar amount is that we expect out of ESSER 3. That's what you see there. And I'll explain a little bit more about why we don't have all of those funds encumbered at this point. But we are now fortunately moving from the health and safety issues to accelerating academics. And so our academic strategies are frankly much more expensive. And so you'll see more about that in just a moment. Now that staff has begun the school year, those ESSER 2 academic strategies, you're going to see that we spend quite rapidly in the next 9 weeks in that area. I'll just call out, we have our Blend Ed program that is our all virtual program. That staff is completely funded out of ESSER 2, for example. So it's not a general fund expense. It's most certainly allowable under these pandemic funds, as it is certainly relates to families' comfort with children being in person.
Let me ask this.
Yes, Mr. Ragland.
Thank you again, Ms. Moser, for this. Regarding Blend Ed, how many students do you know are currently utilizing Blend Ed as an option for education?
I will have to get that exact number for you, but it's about 700 is the number that we are staffed to serve.
Yes, ma'am.
And certainly if those numbers increase, we are prepared to add additional staff.
Okay. That was going to be my question. Would these funds go to expanding that if there is a need, just in anticipation of having to make some adjustments based on some of the numbers that we're seeing in the public? So.
Most definitely. And so that's actually part of why you see planned in a couple of areas. Yes. What we have found more than anything else is that we have to be, we certainly need to have our strategies in place, but we need to be as agile as possible in an organization of this size. And where perhaps we thought that we were going in one direction, it does look like we need to make sure that we have the ability to shift should additional students need to be served in the remote environment.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Absolutely. Let me move to the next slide.
Before you do,
Yes.
just make sure I understand, ESSER 1 and ESSER 2 substantially are the same allowability requirements?
That is correct. In fact, for the most part, ESSER 1, 2, and 3 have very similar requirements.
So I guess maybe it's a question is, as I look at ESSER 2 already has some encumbered dollars, but there are some of them in ESSER 1 that is still available. How that business decision, making sure that you don't lapse any old, because those monies are going to expire first versus the ESSER 2 money.
I'm so sorry.
Yeah, it's okay.
So the reason that you see some dollars remain in ESSER 1, even though we've begun to pull from ESSER 2, is that there are some strategies that we have begun under ESSER 1 that we know are going to continue through this school year. One of those examples is expanded, we've hired more custodians, and we're providing more overtime, more hours for the custodians that we previously had. So in order to be sure that we have those dollars on the line for those employees who we have hired, we are keeping some funds in ESSER 1. We know that we will spend those out because we already have, we've hired that staff. We have contracts with them.
Very good, thank you.
You're welcome.
And one of the pieces there that's a little different with the introduction of the ARP or the ESSER 3
Yeah.
is we're allowed to plan and spend ESSER 1 and 2 concurrently, but we can't tap into ESSER 3 until 1 and 2 are done.
Until those are gone?
Yes.
I got you.
Yes,
Very good, thank you.
Thank you for that clarification.
absolutely. Thank you. And so we've seen this slide before. This is the one about ESSER 1. And as you look down that list, you can see that, again, at the beginning of the pandemic, we were heavily interested. We wanted to make sure that our health and safety needs were addressed primarily. We also shifted very quickly to remote instruction and needed to hire a great number of Chromebooks, laptops for staff. We bought hotspots. So you see a number of health and safety items in ESSER 1. We also invested in some additional online platforms. So that's where you see Apex and digital curriculum. Obviously, it wasn't as easy to get textbooks in the hands of kids when we were in remote instruction. And then you may recall that at the beginning of last school year, we delayed the start of school and actually provided 2 weeks of intensive professional development for all employees around teaching in a remote environment as well as SEL. So the great news is that we certainly continue to keep some dollars on the lines to continue to purchase masks and sanitizer as we need them. But the next couple of minutes, we're going to talk about those more academic-focused strategies. And so while the language in the law speaks to learning loss, in Columbus City Schools, we're talking about learning recovery and addressing learning gaps, and certainly addressing social emotional needs as well. I think that it's helpful to look at some of our planning and processes. So as we carried out our planning for ESSER 2, we considered these factors, and you see them listed on the slide. This guidance came from our partners at the Council of Great City Schools. So in alignment with other work that the district has been involved in, certainly that our board has participated in, we have worked very closely with other schools that are in across the country but of similar size and in demographics, and have certainly used these overarching goals in our planning process. Certainly reopening safely was a primary goal, and then addressing those accelerated learning strategies. So what are the details in the ESSER 2 plan? See if it's going to move. Okay. So we are factoring very heavily on social emotional supports. You may recall that we have added additional school counselors. Our goal is to have a full-time school counselor in every building. We are almost there. We were able to hire most of the 33 that were planned, and that hiring department is still working to identify about 5 additional highly qualified school counselors. But we were clear from the beginning of that strategy that it wasn't about just hiring school counselors, but making sure that we had the right fit and that we have the best candidates. So we do have additional school counselors available in the majority of our schools on a full-time basis. You also see technology, and we will be, all students will have access to a Chromebook that they would be able to use in school and at home. They're currently taking those back and forth. We are finding that we've had a number of Chromebooks that had a rough summer, it looks like, and are in need of some repair. So the district has purchased additional devices to make sure that if the device isn't working quite right, that's not a barrier. Additionally, you see that we will be addressing the last 16 buildings next summer that do not have air conditioning. And those last 16 will receive a ventilation upgrade and have air conditioning by the end of next summer out of those ESSER 2 funds. We are able to address a few other school facility issues related to ventilation. Again, that is an area that is not typically allowed in federal grants. Most of the time that has to be funded in another way. So we do have approximately $44 million allocated towards those ventilation upgrades. We are still looking at how to reduce the spread of COVID in classrooms and in schools. And so we're funding additional every elementary school has an additional lunch time that they're able to build into their schedule. In that way, we can spread students out a little bit more. That wasn't quite as much of an issue in most of our middle and high schools, but if the principal is requesting an additional lunch supervisor, we've certainly been able to supply that as well. To address instruction, we have primary literacy support professionals in our elementary schools. Those are licensed teachers who provide intervention services above the classroom teachers. We are also able to reduce class size in many of our neediest schools by the use of ESSER funds. We're able to have some additional teachers, again, in our neediest schools. The role of our family support has certainly shifted under the pandemic, in that family ambassador role that we've had in schools for the last number of years has actually had a major revamp. The duties have been expanded. The pay is more competitive, I would say, at this point. It was really in the past a nominal stipend, and we have been able to increase the funding and the pay for those positions. They offer an incredible resource in outreach to the schools. We also have regional leads. We were not organized in quite that way before. Every school had a family ambassador, but we now have someone in each region who also coordinates across the region to make sure that events, for example, are not all calendared at the same time, that if a family has students in multiple schools, that they can participate more easily. Additionally, we have hired bilingual liaisons to support in our schools with the highest number of English learner families. Those liaisons are able to work with families. They can certainly provide support for parent participation in meetings about special education issues, testing, but also just ongoing support, how to help my child at home. We talked a little bit already about Blend Ed, and I'll make sure that in the follow-up we have exact enrollment numbers for you. But we also have been able to use the funds according to their intention, and that is to allow us to innovate in a couple of different areas. The learning technology team is new. That is most certainly became an apparent gap when we all moved to remote learning. So certainly we know that the process is more than just making sure everybody has a Chromebook or the teacher has a laptop, but the teaching using digital resources is truly a paradigm shift. And so our learning technology team is filling that gap. They are experts in not only the IT use of the computer, but truly how to use the computers for learning. And the other new team we have is addressing training and development for our non-school staff. Many of you are aware that for years and years and years, we've been working on plans on how to help our classified staff better engage in technology, in those social emotional needs of students. And so we have a training and development team. They've just gotten started. They are small but mighty right now, and they are beginning their work with our operations department to address longstanding training and development needs there. I'm going to pause for just a moment because great teamwork. Dr. Klein just provided me the number. We currently have 603 enrolled in Blend Ed with the ability to provide expanded services. We're staffed to 700.
Sure, yes, ma'am. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, thank you.
You're very welcome. And thank you, Dr. Klein. So I like this chart here because I think it really demonstrates that we are on track with our planning. So lots of little pieces of this pie, but two things that I would draw your attention to. I would expect, and that's what we see here, that blue piece of the pie comes from academic services. We would expect that the majority of our strategies would be academic in nature. That red piece, that's about a quarter of the pie, comes out of transformation and leadership. So those are the strategies that are specific to a school or a group of schools within the district. It looks small on the chart, that little yellow capital improvements slice. And really, it's small because the main strategy is really just one strategy, and that's addressing that HVAC. And then you see the orange indicates the strategies coming out of our data center. So that's around Chromebooks, laptops for teachers, things like that. So again, I intend to provide you additional detail each time we meet about these funds. But what I think, again, this chart best demonstrates is that we're on track. We will well exceed that 20% threshold that the federal government holds. And as you can see, we're really almost to 75% in terms of academic services and transformation and leadership, which, in my opinion, is where we should be spending those dollars.
I do have a question.
Yes, Ms. Ragland.
Thank you again for very detailed, great information for us. Seeing this much of these funds being used towards student achievement is great, and I know that we're tracking the data very closely to see how our students are responding to this. My concern is about what happens after these funds go away. I'm anticipating wild success with student achievement based on the strategy that you all are implementing. But we're going to need those folks for the long term. And I think that's more of a question maybe for Mr. Pahoric and Mr. Gooding in the committee around what we can start doing now to kind of let the public know that these dollars are, only short-term dollars. However, with the increase in staffing that we're seeing, that's directly tied to students being able to read better and some of the things that we want them to do to perform academically, we're going to need their support. And I wonder how we help Catherine and her team help us get that out to the public. And I don't know, that may be a question for you, Mr. Gooding, but please feel free to jump in if you can.
Sure. I think from the get-go, the team understood that these are short-term dollars. And I had a kind of a mantra which everyone picked up was, you need to let us know, are these one-time expenditures or is this the beginning of an ongoing program?
Sure.
So that question was one of the first that we raised, and Catherine and her team have had a focus on that.
Right.
If you notice in what she handed out to you, there is a table here, and there's a row, and it says probability of continuing, and she has marked them none in terms of the HVAC projects, those are one time, but others are high probability to be determined. So a lot of what she has listed, at least here, is likely to continue. And so two things, how do we get the word out? Well, this is how. Every time we do a presentation,
Right.
We'll talk about this is the beginning of a program. You'll likely ask the same question, and we'll reiterate that yes, since these will be successful, and she mentions here about evaluation of the impact and when it will be. So as that evaluation goes on and we are successful, then we know for sure that will want to continue. And then secondarily, I'm in the process of preparing the November 5-year forecast. So we'll have a point in time where we sit down and we'll walk through, and I'll just ask her, yes, no, yes, no, yes, no. We'll go down the list. We'll come up with a dollar amount. I'll factor it in there, and I just have to include it in 1 year and it'll carry forward, et cetera. But we will, that's another way when we get to the October presentation of the November forecast, you'll hear about, the items that I've included, and certainly among that. And most of this will be out in fiscal 23 perhaps, but certainly after 24. So it's at the tail end of our forecast, but we will have, we'll include that in the forecast. So I think that ongoing conversation that we do through these quarterly updates, and then reiterating that during the 5-year forecast discussions will, I think, how we get the word out.
You also see, Mr. Ragland, too, that there's a 2% investment towards family engagement.
Yes.
That those dollars are allocated for. And that family engagement piece includes coordinators, includes chief executive staff, folks who on the admin and on the street level will be engaging, our school districts, our families, our children as a part of this strategy. Is that a fair assertion on my part?
I would say yes. And I think that while we are certainly already thinking towards October 1st of 2024, I would say it's a little early to, we need to do some impact study
Absolutely.
along the way. That's part of what is intentionally built in, even in the way that we do reporting. The continual question is what have you learned? What are you intending to scale up or scale down? And so we do have a regular impact report for not only each strategy, but essentially each activity within the strategy, so that we can better understand what part of the family engagement strategy worked. Was it adding the liaisons versus increasing the number of hours, such like that? But each of the, within each strategy, the project owner, the strategy owner, will provide regular updates for us. And that will also ensure that we're in good shape to answer all the questions about how funds were used and where they fit within the allowable areas. We actually went far beyond where we needed to be in terms of compliance and added our own internal application. So the dollars are in the district. When a department wants to access them, there's an internal process that we're using to align it to an allowable area, and also determine the metrics for to evaluate the impact. So I do just want to quickly mention future funds with a question mark. We will have ESSER 3 that we'll begin to talk about a little bit next quarter, and we do understand that we will be receiving some additional funds to serve our students who are identified with special education needs. And so that will be a very valuable resource to help ensure that our district strategies around inclusion move forward, that they're fully funded from the beginning. And so we're quite excited about that. So actually that bottom number on the chart is going to grow just a little bit more. But as you have stated a couple of times in your questions, we are being incredibly thoughtful. We have a planning process, and look forward to providing additional updates to this committee. And I'm happy to address any questions.
I thank you for the presentation, Dr. Mosier. We are ready to move forward.
Thank you.
We can go on to the monthly financial report. Mr. Pahort?
Thank you, Chair Cole. This is the monthly financial report for July and August of the first 2 months of the new fiscal year. As I mentioned, the last time I did a report to the Board of Education, the board, through all of their work on strategic planning and working with A.J. Crable and the board agenda diet and board committee diet that you've gone through, I've gone through a financial report diet to try and streamline the information that I share with the board to give them just the high level, really important pieces. And then this committee will see that, as well as get into some of the details that we typically do. So my presentation tonight is a little bit different. The first half a dozen slides or so will be that high level report that I give to the board. I will then stop, and then I'll move on to some other details for you, just to give you an idea of the different format that I'm using and the different take on presenting this information. And you can let me know what you think. I'm sure you know that you have that option. So, financial report for July and August of 2021. Revenues year to date are below plan by about $16 million. Expenditures are below plan about $42 million, thus building a cash balance in that regard about $25 million above plan. And then the other significant highlight for this report is a discussion and seeing some of the impact that the new state aid funding formula has had on our revenue and expenditure activity for the year. Just quickly, the funding formula now is going to fund students where they are educated, which means that for us, those 20-some thousand students that rolled through our formula before and then were deducted as they went off with vouchers or to community schools, they won't be in that revenue calculation anymore, so our gross state aid will be lower for '22. But likewise, as I just mentioned, those deductions will go away as well, and therefore our expenditures will be reduced. So as we got into this, the idea was that at best, this should be a cash balance neutral activity. Now, right now, all we're seeing is data from '21 being run through the '22 formula. So we're not seeing any, and I'll run the numbers here in a minute, we're not seeing any major increases yet. But by the time we get around to October, November, we should see this year's data flowing in there, and then we'll see how this new formula really impacts the district. So that's where we stand. Now, these three topics will be what I want to cover in the next few slides. And I experienced the same thing Catherine has experienced in terms of the technology here. Oh, wait a minute. I'm looking at the wrong screen. My bad. I did this. Okay, I think I'm right. I'm on the second slide. I'm sorry. Okay. The revenues below plan is $16 million. Again, state aid, as you can see here, is significantly below plan because the plan was using the prior year's number, and it's about $35 million below plan because of that change in funding. The other only notable item is that our property tax allocation, that rollback on homestead exemption, is $16.6 million above plan at this point, simply because we received it in August, and I put it in the plan for September. On the expenditure side, community schools and vouchers, $33 million below plan. Again, there are no deductions now for community schools and vouchers. So using that plan against the May forecast, obviously we're running below. That small amount there that you see, about $28,000, that's CCP, College Credit Plus. We get into the acronyms and I forget what it is. So that's CCP. That will continue to flow there, but as you can see, it's a much smaller number. And on the non-personnel side, the items, there are a few above plan and a few below plan, but they net to about $4.5 million above plan. So all in all, the most notable thing is that community school deduction not being there. Now, the other bullet point I shared was this change in the state funding formula. And it was very interesting as I pulled this together. I pulled the foundation statement from June and then the one from August, and I laid them side by side just to highlight some of the differences. And unlike many of the other changes in the funding formula, somehow these tended to line up fairly easily for me to make this comparison. So we start with line A, which is our gross number of state aid, and you can see that in '21 that was about $342.6 million. Well, now this year it's $130.5 million, so that's gone down. The additional aid items relatively unchanged, 25.6 last year, 26.1 this year, relatively unchanged. And so the total state funding number is declined from $368.3 million down to $156.6 million. When we move over to this next section called transfers and adjustments, you can see in '21, note the three items here I have shaded: community school transfer, STEM schools transfer, and scholarship transfer. Those line items do not appear in the 22 calculation. And so you can see here we had deductions of $213.7 million in '21, and yet in '22 that drops to $1.3 million. So when we get down to the net state funding number, and I don't know if I mentioned this earlier, but we often talked about how we were going to be net aid funded when we were going through this process. These are the two numbers you compare, 154.5 and 155.3 million. 700,000 or so. So it worked out that this formula, using last year's data, we are net funded. So revenue went down, expenditures went down, and as you can see here, the net change on our cash balance, if you will, we had 211 211.6 million drop in revenue, and then the transfers and adjustments, those expenditures. That says 212, but that's the impact by reducing a negative. You actually increase your cash balance. Okay, so that goes up by 212, and we got a $784,000 difference. So when Eric and I work on looking at the new funding formula and the old funding formula and try and run the numbers and reconcile all of that, we got down to about $700,000, and we went, okay, we're good. We understand how this is working, and it seemed to jive. So we won't know again how this actually plays out for us until we get to the November calculation of the 5-year forecast. We will revise our spending plan that we use for these comparisons at that point in time. So in the meantime, these variances are going to look very skewed, and I will look beyond those two line items to find out if there are other individual items that might be noteworthy. For instance, the homestead and rollback timing, to call those out. But when you see the report in the aggregate, it will look really strange. Revenue's way behind and expenditures are way behind, okay? And this is where I pause. That's my presentation to the board, the brief and straightforward piece of it, to give them the major highlights of the report. For our committee, which won't be presented next Tuesday by Scott, because I'll be out, this is your typical picture of revenues year to date. As you can see, the drop in state aid is pretty obvious in this chart, and on other revenues, you'll see that property tax allocation is received with no plan. So that just bears out what I had to say in terms of the highlights. Here's our heat map, and as you can see, state aid is all in the red. Of course it is. And then that's the major contributor to that year-to-date variance being unfavorable. We look at expenditures. You see here personnel is running under plan. And the issue here, this is the first 2 months. We really won't have a good picture until we get into September when new staff begins to be paid. The agreed to increases are factored into payroll. So we'll see that come in play in September. So we'll look at that monthly variance to see how close we are on a monthly basis, and likely kind of eat away at that year-to-date variance over time as those new folks and the new wage increases take place. And you can see the charter there. That's the one that gives you a good idea that they don't exist anymore. And in the all other expenditures, you'll see here that purchase services are down, supplies are ahead of plan fairly significantly. That's just a purchasing pattern difference from previous years. And other than that, it's reasonably neutral. One of the things that we've been discussing too is to look at our financial results on a quarterly basis to kind of smooth out these variances. When I get that data, I'll present that to you, see if that's a picture that might be more worthy of a discussion than the month-to-month ones that are often just timing issues. So we'll talk about that with you once we get that data. And here's the heat map for expenditures. You can see quite a bit of it's in the green. That charter school line clearly very favorable as is personnel, and it drives the total line into the very favorable category. Once we implement the 5-year forecast in November and implement that as our plan, I will likely pull that charter line out because we no longer have to call it out. So that will be a change. So that's a monthly financial report, 2 versions, if you will. Kind of the financial report light at the beginning to share with the board, give those highlights, and then some of the detail that you're used to receiving and discussing at this meeting. So that concludes my report on the July and August financial report.
Thank you, Mr. Treasurer. Are there any questions?
No, I thank you, Stan, for that. I think, I thought the first few slides are adequate for what we need at the board level. I think one of the things that we talked about was for those board members that do have a special interest, attending these meetings and hearing from you when you're giving the full report may be helpful for them. So that we don't have to get too deep into the weeds during the board meeting. But I thought what you presented tonight would be really good. So thank you.
And I will point you to board docs for the next board meeting. we've worked together on what I'm including in my presentation section. It used to just say it's going to be a presentation. I've taken, and in your written MD&A, I've added a front page with a 1-paragraph executive summary. And then I get into my regular MD&A discussion. So we took that executive summary, plugged it into Board Docs, and then added a link in Board Docs right to this meeting, also on Board Docs, so that they can go right to this agenda, see these attachments, which are a little bit more detailed, as well as view the video if they so choose. So I think we're developing that loop of linkage of information, which is really good.
Mr. Brown?
Thank you, because that was exactly my question about which information will go to the board beyond what your presentation is. So thank you, that's just right.
Perfect, thank you.
I love it too, just as a recommendation, if we can include, particularly on the state appropriation, a per capita number, an estimated per capita number per student. So kind of when we talked through this early on, we kind of deduced that this was around $3,200 a kid. But I think that'll also be helpful as context to put things into proper perspective, just what that kind of per capita state appropriation estimated looks like.
I can do that. Yeah, we can. In fact, when you say that, it's fairly easy for us to look at the actual lines in the forecast in our report. It's simple division. We can run the AD, our enrollment number, and you can see while it's maybe 3,000 and change in state aid, what is it in local property taxes? What is it from other revenue sources that go towards providing the source of revenue? And then legitimate question on the expenditure side.
Yep. Understanding too that every kid is just not going to be funded the same.
Correct.
Based on their level of need for additional resources, what have you. So yeah, but thank you for that. Awesome.
And Chair Cole, just real quick, I just want to, I know it doesn't impact the finances here, but it impacted finances statewide. Just want to make sure we give a shout out to Katie with her day job and her work at OASWA as Deputy Executive Director. Getting that new school funding plan in place was a huge task, so thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Katie spent a lot of time down at the State House working on that, so.
Absolutely. Thank you so
We're benefiting
much.
from that, so thank you.
Now all we have to do is work to make sure that it gets implemented and exceeds, goes beyond this biennial budget, right? Right. We want to move beyond just this biennial budget. We want a continuing commitment. So thank you so much. Yeah, with all of me, I thank you for that. Okay. Our monthly financial report has been gone through. Our FAC agenda schedule, Mr. Treasurer.
Thank you very much. What I wanted to do, I guess this is the word, was to take some topics we want to cover and calendarize them. Is that a word? I've heard that out there. So we wanted to look forward and schedule some things. For instance, Catherine's ESSER updates. We wanted to identify when those quarterly meetings would be. We decided that we felt the committee might want to talk about our enterprise funds. Those funds that are run like an enterprise, i.e. they have to stand on their own. They generate revenue, they have expenses, and the folks managing those are running an enterprise. So see if I mention them all. It's Latchkey, it's our radio station, WCBE, it's Adult Ed, and it's our food service fund. So I hit all 4 of them. And so if you agree with this schedule, we're going to reach out to those managers and let them know that we'd like to have a brief conversation about, what are your sources of revenue? How do you manage that? What are we doing on the expenditure side? Just explain to us how that works as an enterprise fund, because typically what you hear is only the expenditure side from all the budget managers because they're cost centers.
Right.
And I'm doing all the revenue estimate side of things in the general fund and many of the other funds. But these are 4 very unique enterprises that we operate, and they are, it's a good story to tell. I'll just leave it at that and let them speak to that when we get there.
Mr. Brown.
Thank you. Stan, with respect to those enterprise reports, I understand clearly you didn't mention, and it's not one of the enterprise, but athletics. Is there a way to do a presentation that kind of looks at the financial impact of athletics or extracurriculars on what we're doing? So, it's not something that we've looked at here, to my recollection, And I think it'd be, helpful at least to be aware of what those numbers are looking like.
Sure, and that's a kind of a multi-funded
Right.
activity. Some general fund, some student activity fund activity. But yeah, can we do that? Yes, we can. If this committee would like to ask me to do that, I will certainly reach out to those involved in those activities and see what we can fashion in terms of a report that describes those revenue sources and expenses as well. So yeah, we can do that.
And my thought is that after the first time, we can evaluate whether it makes
Sure.
sense to continue or not.
So those enterprise discussions, I've calendarized them here, and you can see that we'll talk about that in November. And we'll talk about all 4 or 5, as the case may be, of those each time. I thought about doing one each time, and in conversation with Chair Cole, we felt, look, let's visit them quarterly until kind of, Board Member Brown, as you described, if we decide it's not necessary, then we can do that. But for the start, we'll get everybody prepped up to roll in here quarterly and have those discussions. I put on the 5-year forecast and whatnot, and then this committee is serving as our millage committee as a proxy for that, because we had a millage committee back in 20. But we have 3 very interesting discussions coming up that could require an additional tax levy. One is an operating levy discussion, centers pretty much around the 5-year forecast. What's it look like? And as you know, I do the 5-year forecast and go out an extra 3 years. And so I'm not really looking 2 or 3 years down the road. I'm looking 6, 7, 8 years down the road to back up and have that discussion about what kind of operating levy need we might have. So I've planned to begin that discussion with the committee in November. October, you talk about the forecast. November, the board approves it. We'll come in November right before that approval and talk a little bit about what does the forecast tell us in terms of operating levy timing. I put on the December calendar for additional discussion of that. I'm sure we may not get it all done in one setting. And then in January, I would like to do an introduction to the PI needs. I've spoken with Dr. James. He actually came to my office and says, well, Stan, what do you think I need to know? Oh, he's here. He may want to chime in, but he asked me, what do you think I need to know? And I says, I think you need to know you're on the docket to explain the permanent improvement levy to the FAC. Surprise, surprise. So he'll be working with that. I'll show the information we've done before. But around January, we ought to talk about those life cycle replacement plans and needs and what the impact is for a potential PI levy. And I left 2 meetings for that and let that trickle over to the February meeting as well. Also in February, we're going to begin the FY23 non-personnel budget discussion and presentations. Then in March, we'll follow that up. We got the ESSER update, but we also will be looking at the FY23 personnel budget items. April, we're back to talking about the forecast, but also going on right now and concurrent then with our discussions about an operating levy and a PI levy, we have the FMP process, the Facility Master Plan process, that has been ongoing for several months now. And they're going through quite a few different phases of discussion and development. But come the springtime, they're going to need to have some results that go to the Ohio Facility Construction
OSFCC.
OFCC. And they need to present that information to them to see about state co-funding of that. So I have calendarized April as a time for those FMP recommendations to come to this committee. And this is kind of my idea, and I floated by all of you. I think that once this committee has heard about an operating levy, and they hear about a PI levy, and then they get the results from the FMP, and all of those have a cost to them. All of them involve timing of when you go on the ballot. You all, and I was pretty aggressive. I promised the folks that I talked to as I was putting this together, I said, I'm confident the committee can listen to all of that and digest all of that.
Absolutely.
And within a meeting go, well, I think we should plan for that like this. What do we do in 22? Do we wait to 24? What are the impacts of all of that? I think we've talked about this enough that we'll be able to put our heads together and come up with a package, what I call a package recommendation, that we can then take to the board in May and recommend, we think you should do this relative to those 3 types of needs and those 3 types of levies. That's the April part. And then May, back to enterprise, and in June, Catherine comes back and talks about ESSER funds, and we'll be closing out the fiscal year at that point. So that's how I calendarized that, how I thought it would all fit together. And we'll be plenty busy, I'm sure, with all of this activity going on.
Thank you so much for that proposed schedule. Are there any questions at this point? Because I think this actually, yes, Mr. Brown?
Yeah, briefly. Stan, I understand the timetable, and I like that in the reports. How does the scheduling of those presentations on those pieces of tax issues that could go on the ballot, how do they link with the potential for being on the ballot in '22? Do they correspond and allow for that?
Yes.
Okay.
What I did was
Obviously, no decisions have been made.
I took the November 22 date and the resolutions and actions the board has to take, and I started backing up. I stayed away from July, because that's when the board takes a hiatus, so there's nothing there. So I get into June, there's certain things you need to have it done in June. I recognize that this is a big discussion, that the board probably wants more than one meeting to do that. So I just backed up and said, look, you're going to have to adopt some resolutions, the second board meeting in June. You're going to want to talk to it at least a meeting or 2 before. So I wanted all that information to press people to bring all that information to the board in May so that the board can digest that and take their time, if you will, if a month is taking your time, to decide, here's all that we've heard, here's all that we've read, here's what the committee or committees are recommending, and then you can make a decision there after hearing it in May and June and pull the trigger if you so choose.
That's really helpful, and that's great. I would suggest that the board take a fresh look at that July off at some point, and not just assume that's the board's continuing view, and whether there are things of importance, especially that are time sensitive, that we not be, perhaps the board not be averse to meeting.
Absolutely. In fact, I agree with that. I think, President Adair has actually done quite a good job of, helping us not only think through managing the calendar per annum, but also us having the willingness to step forward in July if needed, or take an extra meeting in any given time of our operative calendar. So I agree with you, and I think that we have a president and a vice president who certainly show themselves amenable.
Yeah. That also needs to take into account one of the important things. It's the staff, the administrative staff, who have to work to present and do a board meeting. And we have to do it cognizant of that and make sure that we at least think about and understand the workload that you all have.
Absolutely. I think that the way this calendar is structured functionally, though, actually helps us do that. Because to your question earlier to Dr. Mosier, I think that there is some coinciding here that can actually happen. As much as we have to talk numbers and what something costs, we also have to talk vision and how these costs then are attributed to that. And I think that those conversations kind of happen in tandem. And maybe in some instances, not necessarily in this meeting, but most assuredly in our board meetings, in our board discussions. We definitely want to make sure that we're clear on what the vision is, what we're telling the community that they're going to get as a result of this prospective investment that we're asking them for. So I see some mutuality here, some kind of coalition here. So thank you guys for that feedback. Any additional? All right, provided that, is there a motion to adjourn?
Moved.
All right, moved and seconded by?
I missed that entirely.
Moved by Mr. Ragland, seconded by Mr. Brown.
Okay, Mr. Ragland and Mr. Brown. All right,
All in favor, or?
Aye.
Aye.
motion carries. Good.
Thank you. This meeting is adjourned. So thank you so much for your attendance. I know that getting to this setting can be a little different. Absolutely no need to apologize.
We'll be
Everybody's
here.
gone through that.
We'll be here from now on. This is it.
Absolutely, just a little bit different. We'll make sure staff is on hand to leave cheese and breadcrumbs as well. Be well, everyone. Thank you.
You know, it's like,
Katie, are you traveling?